Hey everyone, I am here hosting a Q&A session with John Peterson. So he was the main resource behind our latest video on the birth of wargaming and Kriegspiel here. So unfortunately, we tried to host a live stream but had some technical issues on my end. So we're taking this offline just because this is an opportunity I didn't want to miss. So we're going to be fielding a lot of the questions that you guys had posted online as well as some of my own. So we're going to break this down into a couple different sections. The first is just going to be the guest introduction. I'll read off my questions and then we'll have a discussion, and then I'll follow up with some of the community questions that were posed. So section 1, like I said, is just the guest intro. Section 2 is going to be covering the birth of wargaming, and then section 3 is going to be playing at the world. So let's go ahead and take it from there with the first section. So as I said, I'm here with John Peterson. He's here live. And John, maybe you can tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me. I love the video. I love the stuff you're doing. So it's really a pleasure for me to be here because I'm super into this stuff. For the last 15 years or so, I guess, is when I got really serious about studying the history of war games and role-playing games. And I guess I especially focus on kind of the transition between them because I'm fascinated by that whole cultural moment of the 1960s and 1970s, which was not just a point when war games started to evolve into role-playing games, but also, of course, when computer games started to ramp up. And so something clearly enormously happened in intellectual, history, enormously important in that period. And I really felt like that wasn't receiving adequate attention. And so I got super serious about it. And that led, after about a 5-year initial investigation of this, into a book called Playing at the World, which is a very long book. It's very detailed, that although it's focused largely again on kind of the transition of war games to role-playing games, I also go very deep back into war games because I think there's so many innovations that they produce that have had a tremendous impact on popular culture today. More recently, I guess people may know who follow D&D, I was involved in a project that's called Art and Arcana, that is a D&D book that came out last year, that kind of chronicles the history of the D&D brand from the immediate kind of events that led up to the publication of D&D in 74, up to the present, up to this amazing cultural moment that D&D is having right now. And just from having kind of published this initial book, I've been involved in a lot of academic projects since, like the Zones of Control anthology, which is a great book about kind of the overall scope of wargaming that MIT did 3 or 4 years ago now. And if you're a convention fan, if you went to Gen Con for the 50th Gen Con, I helped to curate the Gen Con museum that we staged for that. And so I do a lot of things like that that just kind of try to throw light on this amazing hobby and what it has meant for popular culture today.
Yeah, and that's really cool. Like I've been involved in this culture in various means, one way or another. Kind of wargaming when it comes to Total War and the video games, but then also used to do a little bit of Warhammer, and now currently getting into D&D. And it's so cool, like you say, that this community is exploding, but it doesn't quite have a sense of its own history. So I'm glad that you and others are stepping in to make that present, and it really enriches the hobby and the community. So thank you again for your work there.
I'm trying.
Yeah. And then I did have another question. So specifically, what got you into this rabbit hole to start off with?
Yeah, so I mean, the story I usually tell about this, after World of Warcraft came out, I was playing a lot of WoW. Like classic vanilla WoW took over my life, as it did, I think, a lot of people's lives then. And I've been playing computer games obviously since I was a kid. And really, I didn't actually play that much D&D when I was a kid. I played more kind of war games and tabletop games, Diplomacy, Cosmic Encounter, Titan, games like that when I was a teenager. But WoW, and I mean this just fell for me out of Warcraft 3. I was obsessed with Warcraft 3, and so when WoW came out, I was a 0 day adopter. And after a couple of months, maybe this was like February or March of 2015, some friends of mine staged an intervention actually and dragged me to England to go to a rock festival there. And while we were there, we were staying a couple of days in London. And I happened to go with them to the British Museum, and having just like lived in like Azeroth for the last, whatever that was, 5 or 6 months then,
Hmm.
I saw one of those first century AD Roman 20-sided dice in a display case. Now you see these things online all the time. People post these things, but for me, I had never seen one before, and I just had this moment where I wondered how far back everything went. That everything that you saw go into WoW and into Warcraft and into the games that preceded them, like, I mean, the thing that really struck me off the bat, the question I posed like that very hour standing there in the British Museum was, there must have been a moment in history when somebody first rolled a die against a table of probabilities to determine whether or not like a fictional event happened. And
Hmm.
it seemed to me like that had to be the birth of the concept of simulation. And so that was really the first thing I went out to try to find out, was, who had written about this. And, there must have been somebody that had seen that as a turning point in intellectual history. And of course, there have been dice forever, and statistics and probability hadn't been around forever, not in the sense that would let you make a table about it. But, there had to have been somebody that first kind of combined these elements. And so I started reading what books there were about the history of wargaming and what stuff there was out there kind of about the history of D&D and why tables work the way they did in D&D, since clearly WoW builds heavily on those initial principles. And that's what really got me started. And once you kind of find one source, then it's okay. So I learned from this source. I need to go find this guy named Rice Fitz. Well, like, where can I find his stuff? And that's what started me on my quest.
Excellent. Well, we can circle back up to this, and I definitely want to talk about kind of the places you explored and things you saw. But we'll tack that on at the end. So maybe now, just before we pivot on to kind of digging into the meat of the video and the topics we covered, could you just queue up some of the other cool projects you're working on?
Sure. I mean, I work on a lot of things again on this edge of what were computer games versus analog games, and so there's a piece I have that's coming out. This is going to air pretty much immediately. I think it comes out this week in a journal called ROM Chip that is about the origins of 4X games, which is something that I'm really fascinated by. I play a lot of StarCraft. Certainly, I played a lot of like Civ and Master of Orion and games like that. And so, yeah, I kind of went looking for what were the first games that had this kind of, exploration, expansion, exploitation, and extermination mechanic to them. And so this is a piece that's about games in the 1960s, going back to 1966, that were played by post that spun off from diplomacy. And that's a subject I'm just endlessly fascinated by, is the way that these, especially postal systems, like before there were the interwebs, like the way that people had to,
Hmm.
figure out how to hold these games, and the way that doing things by post can let you have kind of secret information in ways you wouldn't if you're just all sitting around the same tabletop. So there's just a lot of kind of contingent facts about the way you implement games like that I think are really fascinating. Um, I've been doing a lot of work on this work I did last year, largely on wargaming in occupied Paris, the people who in the 1940s were playing war games. And I recently released a piece about that that is kind of dealing with their war game system and how they conceived it and what happened to these people who in like 1943, in like the darkest days of the occupation, were handwriting in these like clandestine booklets they're hiding from like the Germans, these war game systems, and like how they were connected to the underground and all this other stuff. And so there's like little stories like this that I just find in the course of my research that I think are fascinating, that I write about. I also have been working on a corporate history of, I guess, the way the role-playing game industry evolved from the war game industry, kind of especially focused on 1975 to 85, and this immense explosion that, of course, also coincided with the beginning of the computer game industry. Um, that's what I'm fascinated. And right now, I love dice. Dice is like the main thing. Like you guys, right now, I'm working on. I've been trying to get deep into who started manufacturing polyhedral dice here in America, specifically for the gaming market, and kind of being able to learn to identify and sequence all these early dice, because now like hundreds of millions, maybe billions of these dice have been made since then, and kind of looking at who did it first and why is a question I'm focused on a lot right now.
Excellent. Well, it looks like we got the right guy for this for this series of questions. And again, to the audience listening, I mean, if all of these sound fascinating, let me know. And we can definitely, in the comments below or in the description, post links to all this stuff that John's working on, and then hopefully host a functioning live Q&A in the future to dive deeper into these. But yeah, that's it for this first section. So let's get into the second part, which is going to be the birth of wargaming. So this is kind of what we covered in the video. So the impetus for all this was, from my end, I had been talking about, critiquing Game of Thrones. A lot of the times in Game of Thrones, they were standing around these Kriegspiel-esque tables. I didn't know it at the time that that's what that was, but that's what they were doing. So I did a takedown of that, saying, hey, did they have those in medieval times? And the answer was no, not really. And then that was like, okay, well, then when did that come about? And then that's how I got into this birth of wargaming. So in the video itself, I kind of trace John's research in broad strokes. We miss a lot of the details, but basically we go through, the early days of chess, some of the iterations on the great game, and then you start to get into Helvig. And then from there, it starts to pick up speed, and this tangent quickly forms a pretty distinct break from these variants of chess that we had previously. So my question to you, John, is kind of in these early days, kind of up to Helvig, what other interesting war games did I not cover in the video that you think might be relevant to bring up?
Yeah, I mean, I think you did a great job in the video. Like I said, I think it really distilled a lot of the key information on this. I mean, I think it's easy when you talk about something as broad as wargaming. There are scope and definition questions you run into, right? Like there's a thread of wargaming that is tabletop simulation, right? And I think that's the part that you covered and covered quite well. That really did come from chess to the King's game, to Neue und das große Königspiel, the Weichmann game you talked about, and then into Helvig and Reiswitz and these other figures. But of course, there were also traditions of war games that were live war games, right? That were done, exercises, military exercises soldiers would conduct that were non-lethal in nature. And there's a whole tradition that surrounds this, and there are books we could point to for people that write about like those flavors of war games. And there are a variety of kind of abstract games of strategy that we might suggest are comparable to war games. Go is an example of this, right? Where it really just depends on your semantics, on your definitions of these things, whether you want to include them in it or not. But I think to capture the things that led to the innovations in computer games we play, I think you hit the right notes. Actually, those I think are the games in that tradition are the key games to hit.
Were there any similar histories you found in kind of other areas of the world? I know we focus mostly on Western Europe, but is there anything, say, in China or the Middle East or other places that had some early iterations? Maybe they didn't go the full evolutionary route that we went, but maybe had some advancements that are of note.
Well, I mean, again, chess itself is of Middle Eastern origin, right? I mean, most people trace this back, I should say, South Asian probably first, to Chaturanga, to, the Indian variant of chess, which was, I think, much more tied to their traditional branches of the military at the time. And, the movements of the pieces in that were, I think, closer to a simulation of the movement of the four branches of the army, the Chaturangas from the four. And like the movement of elephants and so on being comparable to rooks or whatever, it was key to the way that
Yeah.
they understood Chaturanga. And Chaturanga also had dice in it. There was a certain amount of randomness in it. And as that evolved through Persia, through Shah, right? These are how all of these games ended up transforming into the thing that maybe we'd say Roy Lopez, right, really, nailed into the form that we understand it today. And wargaming, of course, there were Japanese applications of the wargaming techniques that became internationally popular, and there's all kinds of kind of historical precedents like that you can point to. That's a very, very broad subject. There's a great book about H.D.R. Murray's book, the history of board games other than chess, that covers a lot of these sorts of things. It's a great like Oxford history, kind of classic early 20th century sort of history of these things that has a much more international bent than I think I look at personally.
Okay. Well, circling back to the kind of the European theater of things, I also had to cut things out that you had mentioned in your research. So Venturini is one of the ones that I think sticks out to me. So it seems like there were in various countries these kind of aficionados of wargaming who are doing some interesting pioneering. So could you tell us maybe about some of the other ones that we didn't quite cover in the video?
Yeah, I mean, I think Venturini is kind of key. You pick out in your quotations from Playing at the World in the video this line about how scale is a tool that binds the system to the setting. That's really something that I think Venturini got. that maybe Helvig hadn't quite gotten. Like, Venturini really thought about the board that he was establishing, not like it was a chessboard, but like it was an actual map.
And
And that
he's someone operating out of Prussia, correct?
well, I mean, he was, I
Or
think he
sorry,
was,
outside of, like, in France, I think, right?
no, I think he was in like Hamburg, if I recall. He
Ah,
was like
damn, all the
up
the
north there.
Germans. They're all
Yeah,
over
just
this
the thing,
community.
whatever their names are, right? There's this German guy, Verdi de Vernois, right? You would think, of course, that he's French with a name like that, but no, 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 he's actually German.
Huh.
A lot of this stuff was German, though. After Reiswitz, the game very quickly spread across the continent, and there were Swedish implementations of Reiswitz by like 1830, and there's some great research that's been done on this in the past couple of years, certainly after Playing at the World came out, on what some of these, foreign translations and adaptations of Reiswitz really were. There were also precursors, I guess I'd point to. There's this guy Opitz that when I did Playing at the World, I was aware of Opitz. I read it. He uses dice in some ways that are interesting, and definitely the elder Reiswitz was influenced by some of Opitz's thinking. He had a very interesting war game. And another thing I really left out in Playing the World. So it's this isn't even things that you omitted from my research. These are things I omitted from my research. This guy Eretin, who in 1830 published Strategenon, which was, as far as I can tell, the first attempt to integrate the use of Kriegspiel with toy soldiers, where you actually, because there was a toy soldier industry already in Germany by the beginning of the 19th century. And you could buy figures made by people like Hilbert in Germany. And Aratine really saw how you could leverage these toy soldiers as the things you would move across your battlefield, which isn't as exacting a simulation, right, as Reiswitz is, where Reiswitz wants his blocks to really look the same size as the troop formation would be on a map of that scale, which is a profoundly detailed simulation for his time. But you might say that Eratin kind of anticipated a lot of what would then follow when hobby wargaming began at the end of the 19th century.
Okay, so you have around the time of the Reichswitzes, you have the community emerging. So I'm wondering where the pressures came. Was it mostly people trying to do military education, or was it people trying to build out from the toy industry for like stuff that people could buy off the marketplace just to play at home?
I mean, early on, I think it really was at least supposed to be military education. Now, of course, you give a bunch of kids and, people who are in the army, a lot of them are kids. You give them something that can be used for fun, and people are going to start using it for fun. People are going to find like enjoyable practices to build on it. So yeah, I think the pressures at least were probably largely coming from people that were looking for ways to make this tool more effective at instructing soldiers, not just in strategy, but Reiswitz was profoundly concerned about instructing people to write clear orders. And this is one of the reasons why he gives his referee, his Feldwarte, so much leeway to kind of interpret orders that might not be clear that you give to this, particular detachment that then goes off and does something is entirely not what you intended.
Sure, and that's maybe the lessons is something that I want to get back to later, like how practical or how useful did these end up being. But for now, I guess I do want to pull us back a little bit to look specifically at Reiswitz Senior's table. So I posted that on Facebook and in the video itself, and people were blown away by that table. A lot of modern gamers very jealous of that
Yeah.
setup. So a lot of people were asking, where can they find it? And also, how much would a thing like that cost? Maybe at the time, and then maybe even today, if you know if it's publicly available.
Yeah, so it's not publicly available today. I mean, so it's a one of a kind artifact. It's still owned actually by the Prussian royal family. When I was writing Playing at the World back in August of 2009, I was working a lot out of the Prussian Culture Library in Berlin, and at that time, actually, the table was on display at Charlottenburg Palace. You could just buy a ticket to go take the tour of Charlottenburg Palace, and they just had it in one of the rooms there. And so yeah, that was an impactful moment for me personally when, even though I was really still just getting started then, I guess I've been serious about it for a couple of years by that point, but just getting the chance to actually see this thing in person was really, really a trip. And obviously, when I worked on Playing at the World, I had them take a number of specific photographs for me to show different kind of components of the apparatus, and some of those were reproduced in the book. And you have a lot of these pictures as well in your videos. So what would it cost? What would it cost to make? I mean, again, you wouldn't make it the same way today, right?
Sure.
You would make 3D printable versions of the tiles and like all the little blocks, and I'm sure that's all eminent.
Kickstarter. It would be a Kickstarter, I think.
It would be Kickstarter. Oh God, give me the Kickstarter to make that. But I mean, the table itself. I mean, again, if you just look at like the feet of the table, right? I mean, it looks like this just beautifully crafted antique from another era because that's what it is.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, and you had made a point that this thing was built for a monarch. It was a plaything, and I think at some point in the research you had said that as different nobility started to get interested, even the I think the kings or the royalty of Russia couldn't get a version. So it was
Yeah.
very, very unique.
Yeah, it was very unique. I mean, obviously, this all changed in 24 and the aftermath of that, when, as you point out in the video, the younger Rice Fitz was able to make these sets that were then available for sale.
Right, and then that's where you get the transition towards mass production. He simplifies things, adds some crucial elements that really set it into a simulation world, and we can talk about that in a second. But yeah, this is where you get that transition to mass production. It spreads around, and then the military kind of soups it up and use it for training, I presume. So that's, I think, if you mention Kriegspiel, I think that's the one that everyone's going to think about for the OG version. That's like the
Yeah,
kind of,
yeah,
yeah.
that's real OG, man.
And is that version also something that you can see in a museum in Berlin?
I'm not sure. So when I was working in Planet the World, I just wanted to find a copy of the 1824 book, right, that would describe
Sure.
what this was. And at the time, the only place I could find that had a complete copy was the University of Kassel, which is in Bayreuth in northern Bavaria. Bayreuth's famous for being kind of Wagner's hometown. They have the big Wagner festival, and that's really the only reason most people ever set foot in Bayreuth. But I actually went there to work from their copy directly in their library, though I now have since managed to get a copy for myself. The copy that I got does not include the apparatus, and yeah, I've no idea who actually has boxes that have the original pieces they used for this. They must exist.
I see, but maybe less durable than that big table. Um,
Yeah.
so while we're on the topic, actually, of you talking about trying to track down this the edition that was published, I do have a question here from the community. Jonathan Goncalves here says, "Where can I learn the rules of Kriegspiel?" So maybe this is the original version. Maybe we can direct people to where they can find it, but maybe like a pared down version if you wanted to play it today. Do you know where people could find either of those?
Yeah, so I mean, I point actually to my friend John Curry's series, and this isn't just for Rice Fits. This is just for kind of classic war games in general. He has put out a series. They're print-on-demand books, things that are largely in the public domain, right? But of the history of wargaming, and you'll find a lot of the titles that are incredibly significant to this tradition are just available, and you can go buy them on Amazon. They're all available print-on-demand. I have also seen, so it's this guy in the 80s named Bill Leeson, who really was the first person who caught the bug that you need to go back to the original sources, as far as I can tell. And he did a couple of different versions of a translation of Rice Fits, one of which includes like the maps and paper chit versions of the unit counters for it. And you should still be able to find those online. I have a copy of that includes a translation of Rice Fits, a way to kind of adapt his unusual dice into normal, what we would recognize as combat resolution tables. So it's a very playable kind of scaled for modern usage version of the 1824 game.
Excellent. And then I see here, kind of to that end, it's the same topic, but Severin Guardsman asks, is the Reiswitz Junior version of Kriegspiel still sold today? So I assume it's been rather simplified, but I guess you can still find some version of Kriegspiel, but I'm guessing doing away with a lot of the odious rules, probably.
Well, like I said, so Lee Sin's version is pretty faithful. I mean, I think it's intended to be a playable version that you can get today. Now, unfortunately, I don't think that's really for sale today. There
Hmm.
was a guy who maybe 2 or 3 years ago in Britain who I was aware was putting out a fresh edition of Rice Fits based on, I think a new translation and, new kind of commentary to help people understand it. I'm not sure that ever came through, but I would love to see someone do that. And again, I would love to see a Kickstarter for someone to go and make something with cool pieces to go with it and everything.
Do you know, and this has been a popular community question, do you know of gaming groups that do this? Like, is there a network, an underground network that you could tap into that does it at gaming conventions or maybe local communities, even in California if you know something local?
Geez, I don't really know. I mean, again, I hang out at places like Gen Con a lot. I'm not aware of people that are doing this. I mean, you know, I should probably be doing it, I guess, while I'm here and
The
running it.
one
But
the one I had found, I think it was called Two Fat Lardies, was the one I think I was recommended. I may be butchering the name, but I think that's the one. But they play a modified version of Kriegspiel, but it's they do different scenarios. So they've done stuff that's like the Franco-Prussian War. They've done Napoleonic Wars. They've done adaptations to make it play in World War II. But I think they do try and keep some of the rules of Kriegspiel, and they play it online to try and mimic kind of people being in two different rooms, and they have the Empire, and they have kind of the dispatches sent between people. So I think it's Two Fat Lardies, and I'll do some research and I'll post the correct link in the description. But that is one of the groups, and I think they do post videos as well, or at least battle reports, which could be cool for those interested.
yeah, I mean, it's a tough game to run. I mean, because of if you're going to run it strictly, the isolation that's required to have kind of the referee be in a separate physical space and the players, have their own maps, and there's just a lot of busy work, I guess, that needs to be done to do it authentically. But it's certainly, yeah. I mean, it would reward the labor to have that experience.
So about the labor here, we do have a community question from Iron General who says, when playing Kriegspiel through mail correspondence, did anyone ever complain about the lag being a factor? So maybe did you come across any anecdotes about that, or maybe tweaks to the rules where they wanted to fix that?
Now, I'll have to go back and read the Elder Reiswitz on this. He has a little autobiographical passage in one of his books where he describes the process of him doing these by mail things when he got out of college. And I don't specifically recall him complaining about lag. I mean, I think, the postal system felt like high bandwidth in the early 19th century. I think it was a miracle that you could really transmit things like this through the post at the time reliably. And so I'm sure that they were thrilled to be able to get through, the few bits per week that they could in that transmission medium.
And I'm trying to put myself in their shoes. That would be so interesting if you go to collect your mail and there's a couple bills in there. There's maybe an advertisement, your aunt, and then you open the last letter and it says 10,000 of your troops have died in the field. The enemy is behind your rear, and there's like
Well,
a full military dispatch. So I can imagine that was some aspect of it that was pretty fun too.
yeah, well, and remember that this was the case in, the 1960s as well, really before the advent of, at least the widespread advent of computer networking. There was a ton of play-by-mail correspondence of diplomacy, of war games. Companies like Avalon Hill, would include play-by-mail rules, and there was a whole Avalon Hill International Kriegspiel Society, is what they actually called it, that would have their play-by-mail adaptations and ways of managing randomness. One of the hardest parts of it is, of course, figuring out how to do random numbers in a way that is publicly verifiable rather than just, oh, I rolled a six, trust me.
Hmm.
And there were all these practices that built up around that. And they were really crucial to the wargaming community becoming the hobby that it is in America, because initially it was so small, there were so few wargamers, they were so thinly spread, that postal correspondence was one of the only ways people had access to these games then.
Wow, it's pretty amazing. Um, okay, yeah, okay. So two more questions that I wanted to get to before we kind of broaden the scope here. So this is specifically kind of the innovations of the Reitzwitzes, senior and junior. They developed Kriegspiel to the modern form, and kind of the big innovations that they had were, you point out in your book, the umpire and then the die. So maybe we can touch briefly on those. So the umpire I thought was really interesting. That's something we take kind of for granted now, especially if you're in the D&D world, the dungeon master. So is this the original, like the earliest form of kind of this dungeon master that we find?
So I think so, and this is one of the major arguments of playing at the world is that the great innovation that the younger Reiswitz integrated into wargaming was this notion of trying to put you into the situation that a commander would be in the field. So in other words, if you're in that three-room scenario I just described, where the umpire's in one room and you're one of the commanders and you're in a private room, you can't see the other commander, you can't really see the umpire. Just imagine there's someone who comes in and gives you field reports that the umpire has written, and your job is to write orders and then hand them off to him. You could imagine you're sitting in a field tent in Jena, right? And like, dispatching these orders when there's like an actual battle going on. Reichwitz's objective was to isolate you that way from the system that underlies the resolution of events in the war game, because he believed that that is what would most effectively train you in the art of war that he was trying to convey with this. And when you look at D&D and the way that it uses the referee or the dungeon master, it has much the same effect. And there are a variety of authors that we can point to as intermediaries that kind of use the same mechanism that gradually turn this from orders you had to write down to things you would just say to the referee. And you would have to make a positive statement of intention of what you're trying to accomplish. And the referee would go tell you, well, as a result of that, here's what happened. What do you do now? And that, yes, that gradual progression certainly is what led to the way that D&D is organized.
And I love that. You can really see it as a seminal moment. And when you say it mimics warfare, I mean, I think this was true once you get into the age of gunpowder and things start to become larger scale. The commanders were not partaking directly on the battle lines. They were mostly, like you said, in the general's tent, and especially later on as warfare progresses, the local headquarters or whatever it is, it starts to become more realistic to those scenarios. But to bring it back to antiquity, there is a little anecdote that I remember reading where Julius Caesar, he's done all these conquests in Gaul and around the Mediterranean. He becomes a very seasoned commander, and they would also get these reports from the field. Oftentimes, the armies would kind of move around, entrench in their fortifications for the night, and kind of hole up there. And there is an instance I recall of Julius Caesar being in his inside that fortification, the enemies around him, and he's receiving these dispatches from his scouts saying, the enemy has taken the river or they're here. And he's literally conducting war games from his tent, sending dispatches, never going out, but he says, okay, send out the scouts. And then they say, okay, at this point, we're at this level of engagement or casualties, enemy cavalry have been spotted. And then he goes ahead and responds appropriately. And he plays out this whole scenario real time from his tent. So I thought that was a really interesting anecdote that stood out to me.
Yeah,
But it's the only real early example that I think I have.
yeah.
Because, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure I know of many like it. Yeah, I mean, certainly, anytime that you can convey real-time information or information that, allows you to react in a meaningful time scale to affect events, that becomes possible. What was, again, so transformative, were the signaling systems and so on that started to develop in the 19th century, especially when things like the telegram became available, and you could actually like wire things and go beyond just semaphores and all these methods that had previously been used to signal information, or waving flags from different sides of the battlefield to kind of give a sense of how dicey things were over there as opposed to over here. But yeah, once warfare became a matter of managing information that way. Once command, at least, became a matter of managing information, suddenly this possibility of a simulation that can simply decouple from the actual practice of war became possible.
Hmm. Makes sense. Well, great. That's the umpire, and I would love to do a follow-up episode or even a podcast on Dungeon Masters and how that's evolved over time. But we'll save that.
Sure.
So that was one big aspect, was the umpire. The other aspect was bringing in the die. So that's something that you'd mentioned was in early forms of chess and some of the other earlier games, but it seems to have really been cemented with Kriegspiel as well. So the dice that I put up and what I gathered from your research was essentially, and maybe we'll take a little bit of time to explain the numbers here is what I'm getting at, but my understanding is basically you have an encounter, the umpire says, okay, the ratio of the forces here is such that it's approximately 2-to-1 odds or something going into it, or a strength ratio. And based on that ratio, you pick one of the die, and that die is essentially weighted based on what's on the faces to favor the one that's 2 as opposed to the one that's 1. And then the results on the different one are going to tell you the severity of the outcome. So there'll be and it's like a scale. So a very poor result, not so bad result, neutral result, or slightly positive or very positive. It's kind of functions in that sense. But I saw a lot of other scribblings on those die. So maybe you can talk a bit more about that, the numbers around there. And then maybe also, did they have something like a D20 or a D10?
Yeah, we can talk a little bit about that. So, I mean, the dice are complicated. And again, if you look at like the way that Leeson adapted Kriegspiel, adapted the 1824 Kriegspiel in his English translation, he just adapts it. Okay, take an ordinary six-sider and just imagine this is the table, and these would be the outcomes if you got like this or that, rolling with the different dice. So, I mean, the dice have a lot of numbers and a lot of markup on them. And this in part reflects the fact that there were three outcomes, right? Whether you have kind of like the R, the G, and the T outcomes that are on them, and this is whether you're repulsed or whether you have like a total victory, or whether you're defeated. Is what the R is really for repulsed, the G is for defeated, and the T is for like totally defeated. And so the numbers that flank those kind of tell you in general what has happened as a result of this action when the face comes up, in the course of resolving the combat. And the numbers, there's these like two different columns of numbers, and there's four each on them. And the four values in each of the columns reflect the ranges that you're firing from if you're either having infantry fire or artillery fire. And so the severity, the number of losses, in other words, that are tabulated, depend on both the range and then which of the faces of the die comes up that you then compare like this different range value to. So it's a bit complicated. I don't know if it comes through without, if we put up various pictures and
Yeah,
we
I'll
kind of
put
like
a
highlight this one and this one, we can kind of explain exactly, okay, so you're firing with artillery, so you use this side of the column, and you're firing from 400 paces. That means the value in losses will be 15 if this face comes up.
I see. Okay, so just if I could reiterate really quickly. So there's an encounter. I want to. I move my infantry up. I shoot at about let's say 200 paces. I roll my die. It says it rolls favorably for me. I look up that column, and since I know that I'm at 200 paces, I deal the damage that's associated with that.
Correct.
Okay, and if I rolled poorly, I would have that same column of damage, but it would be scaled down if I didn't roll as high or something like that.
Correct. If you got like a bad face on the die.
Okay, makes sense.
Yeah, that's basically how it works. And again, it's very easy to take this and transpose it into a table. And by the 1860s, even the German war games had all transposed these into a table. Like, there's no reason to go and have to make like custom dice for this. And that the rice bits, proportional dice, as they're called, they did have to be kind of custom made for this effect. And it's much more straightforward to just use an ordinary, picked D6 and then just compare it to what happens in a column.
That's right. Yeah, and all of us in D&D now are very familiar with these lookup tables.
Yeah, I mean,
Uh,
there are examples we can show since you asked about kind of D20s and things like it. Very famously, there's this word game that's called Strategos, put out by Totten around 1880. And Totten has some tables that call for the use of a 10-sided teetotum. Now, what is a teetotum? It's kind of like a spinning top, like a dreidel. But they came with a number of different faces available in them. So you could find a 12-sided teetotum, you could find an 8-sided teetotum, a six-sider, a four-sider. And so for Totten, you would want this 12-sided teetotum to resolve things in this particular table. And you would spin it. And when you spin this thing and it lands on that particular face, you end up with that result on his table. So people were already thinking about alternative implements of chance.
mm,
And partly there was a bit of prejudice about this, and that normal pipped D6s had a strong cultural association in the 19th century with gambling. And so people really wanted to avoid kind of having them around because people just think you're like shooting craps or something with them. And so they would rather use more exotic implements. I will say that as well, some of these people who made teetotums wanted to have even more than 12 faces to them. They would make what's called a teetotum ball. And I do have an example of one of these very early 19th century, maybe even late 18th century teetotum balls that is numbered 1 through 20. So you can actually find like D20s numbered 1 through 20 that go back that far.
wow, that's pretty amazing. That's cool. Okay, well, let's do two community questions now. These are going to deal with supply chains, and the other one is naval warfare. So let's start with the first one. Um, so Leo Murphy here asks, are logistics a part of the game, or is it ignored like siege and supply chains?
So definitely logistics, including sieges and supply chains, are a big part of a lot of these war games. And there are a bunch of anecdotes about this. I don't want to go too far into the future on this, but late in the 19th century, the author Robert Louis Stevenson was kind of a pioneer of hobby wargaming. Just as an example of the way that supply could factor into this, he actually shot little physical cannons in the war games, the hobby war games that he played. And what he used as projectiles were from type from like a typewriter, the letter M's, because he had this like whole like typewriter like book press set. And so he took all the letter M's and you would actually shoot these from your cannons at enemy soldiers in his game. And literally the number of these M's that you had in a little canister that had to be like dragged along with your little gun would determine like how much supply you had to be able to shoot. But yeah, there are a ton of like supply chain kinds of rules that involve whether or not troops are isolated in these war games. Troops that are isolated from their supply chains, for example, it's usually much easier to take them prisoner than ones that are attached to their supply chains. There are all kinds of rules for baggage, for yeah, definitely for sieges. Even in Helvig's system, if I remember correctly, there are rules for fortification, for ways that you can build up a castle and you'll get a certain like defensive bonus from that. And then there are a variety of rules for kind of how you can array a set of armies around one of these castles to try to get like a siege-like effect. So certainly that was on their minds at the time, and later simulations would explore these things in greater and greater detail. But even from early on, I think people got the necessity of making sure supply chain management was a component of the game because it would be too unrealistic if it weren't.
Sure. And did they track things like ammunition or yeah, ammunition being the primary one, I think?
Well, that was the Stevenson anecdote I was giving. Yeah, I mean, literally his ammunition, because he was using physical ammunition. When you ran out, you were like out of ammo for that gun. So
But is
yeah,
that like the is that in something that you'd find in the Reiswitz versions?
I'm not sure I specifically recall that being in Rice Fits, but some of the later authors I think may have touched that. I'm not sure I remember off the top of my head. I think Von
Okay.
Trotha or something might have done that.
Yeah. Because I assume as you start to get into, like we said, when the warfare changes, where the general becomes increasingly isolated from the battlefield, is one of the major things that happens where you're in the HQ. But the other major thing is you're dealing with so many soldiers. It's not just a game of information, but also war becomes a game of logistics and the rise of these like bean counters in the First World War being very important. I assume that increasingly was something that they wanted to represent in these war games.
Definitely it was. And I mean, the economics of war, especially when you start getting into more like grand strategy games, right? The economics of war became a big part of how a lot of these things we managed. You see more of that in the 20th century than in the 19th in terms of having national budgets for, continent scale campaigns and requiring upkeep and things like it. But that is just the further exploration of the scope of the simulation that these games offer.
Gotcha. All right, and we'll touch on that maybe a little bit as we go. So, final question here in this section, dealing with kind of this early birth of wargaming. Was there anything that was applied for the naval side of things around this time?
Definitely there was. I mean, you can point even almost as old as Helbig. There was John Clerk's work, his essay on naval tactics. It was unsurprisingly British. The British were very interested in the proper simulation of naval warfare. He developed a system for modeling boats and at least a rudimentary combat system that surrounds this. And I think all this stuff is available again in that John Curry series. You can find a lot of these early naval games. Certainly Fred T. Jane's game, that's a little later, that's in the late 19th century. He's famous for Jane's fighting ships, of course, for kind of the catalogs of the various warships of the nations of the world and kind of what their waterline models recognizably would be and how to rate them based on their armaments, their defenses, and so on. Jane developed a very complex simulation system that surrounded all of that, and hobby wargamers obviously picked this up from Fletcher Pratt onwards, all the way up to Gygax and Arneson when they did their first collaboration on "Don't Give Up the Ship" on wargame rules for the Great Age of Sail.
Hmm. Gotcha. And I did, as I was doing some of this tangential research, and is how I found you. I was looking also. I think there's the Naval War College. I think it's in Rhode Island,
Hmm.
and they have a simulation for I think where they capture what people were doing in the Second World War for naval war simulation. I think they still have some museum exhibits up.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of fascinating stuff that's being done today, obviously to capture both historical warfare and modern warfare with simulations. Of course, much of it is moving to computers these days, and but there's still a certain amount of tabletop activity around it.
Gotcha. All right, well, that as we start to talk about modernity, let's just transition to the next section. So this section is a little bit more broad. It's just I entitle it "Playing at the World." So this is past the birth of wargaming, and this is mostly just going to be a pitch for your book, seeing how things splay out from the past into the present. So I'll start here with maybe you can give us an idea of what is the scope that you cover in your book, "Playing at the World."
Yeah, I mean, well, like I said, I was trying to explain the transition I saw between war games and role-playing games, or, it might be more accurate to say I was trying to show how hard it is to draw a line between what the practices of wargaming had become. And when we talk about rice bits, it's pretty clear why, right? Once you start with rice bits and then you get to people, there's this fellow I study named Michael Korn's, this book called Modern War in Miniature that came out in 1966, where he's running referee battles for kind of World War II era games where there's a conversation between the judge and the players, written orders that cover kind of 2 seconds of time of what are you going to do now? Well, you hear this German soldier coming, and what do you do? And yeah, so I guess I wanted to show how deeply rooted these practices were in the simulations that had come from war games. And because of that, I think I largely focus on the years 1964 through 1977 or so. Like by 77, kind of D&D had become what it is. And people understood that there was this thing called role-playing games, and it was at least starting to forge an identity that was maybe distinct from war games by that point. When D&D came out, of course, no one called it a war game. The cover of the book called it these rules for fantastic medieval war games campaigns because that was the closest marketable thing to what they were trying to do that they could put on a box cover and hope that anybody might buy the thing after it got out there. But of course, you can't really do justice to the subject of the transition from wargaming to role-playing games without going back to Helbig and to Venturini and to Reiswitz and to Totten Strategos and all these intermediary works. And I would have loved it if there had been a book that had covered this. If somebody had gone back and found all these things and written kind of an accurate history of all of them before I got started. But originally, I imagined this would be like an appendix. I was going to write about this book. It would be like from 64 to 77. Then I'd have like an appendix about the history of war games. And I'd have another appendix about kind of fantasy fiction and the ways that the concept of fantasy came to life, and maybe something else about theater and improvisation and those sorts of things. But when I actually ended up writing the book, those became the meat of it, to be honest. And so I kind of elevated them from appendices to like major sections of the book. And so there's probably 100 pages just on the history of wargaming in the middle of it, and 70 or 80 just about fantasy. So
Yeah, and it was fascinating. The amount of detail you go into is great. All the pictures, the references, a lot to sink your teeth into. So definitely, if anyone who's viewing this has made it this far, you're definitely interested in the subject. So totally check out Playing at the World. I'll have the link in the description. It'll be an affiliate link. That way, I get a portion of the proceeds to support me, and then obviously John will get a cut as well, which is great.
it is
So
great.
it is great, yeah. And then also his other products for sure. Check them out. Arts and Arcana is a great one. But speaking specifically about Playing at the World, so do you have any cool stories you can tell us about you going out and collecting your research, cool places or things you saw?
It was a bit of a slog, to be honest. I mean, so when I started working on this, I read a lot of what was out there about the history of D&D and about wargaming, and kind of even where to start was tough. And figuring out what the sources are that I wanted to try to hunt down. There was no really good kind of roadmap for me to follow on that. And the great part about it is like every source that I find would like point me somewhere else to some other source that I should try to find. And so you just end up, exploring this chain, just kind of spidering through this like web of influences and interconnected ideas and products and games and so on. Um, I certainly had to go wherever this stuff was to try to find the story, and to see Weichmann, for example, the great King's game. I worked from the copy in the National Library of Sweden in Stockholm. As I said, I had to work a lot out of the Prussian Culture Library in Berlin. They had a lot of the crucial works on wargaming there. I was fortunate to be able to, for kind of modern fanzines, which really are the things that tell the story from 1960 to 1970. Before there were interwebs, like basically the things that forums were then were these fanzines, where like pretty much anybody could just like publish something and other people would write comments that would appear in future issues. And it's kind of like comment threads on, posts you make. And Roger Ebert actually wrote a great piece about this, about how like before the internet, the fanzine community of science fiction fandom and so on was really where people communicated in this way. And even where a lot of our acronyms and abbreviations we use, like LOL and things like that, would appear in these zines because space was at such a premium that they like defined all these ways to abbreviate things and so on. But yeah, I mean, I had to find the research institutions that had these fanzines, and UC Riverside is a good example. I worked a lot from the Bruce Peltz collection at UC Riverside. I also worked a lot from the Bowling Green State University Brown Popular Culture Library, which has a lot of fanzines. And of course, I acquired a lot of fanzines myself. I probably now have 25 or 30,000 of them myself.
Wow.
And a lot of these books, these old wargaming books, I mean, the only way to get them before Google Books scanned all these and put them online was to find. So, I have like a first print of Venturini and things like that, 1797 edition of Venturini, just because that was the only way I could then get access to it. Today, these books that are in the public domain, so many are scanned, so many are available on Google Books. And even a lot of these zines that I study, the zines associated with diplomacy, for example, there are several online projects that have just begun posting those wholesale. So it's becoming easier to engage with this material, easier to study it as time goes on. And I'm sure it will continue to become easier over the next couple of decades.
And we'll have to do a follow-up episode at some point if we can get you to show a little bit of your collection. I'm sure a lot of people would be excited to see that.
Yeah, it'd be fun. Yeah, I mean, I own the first draft of D&D, I mean, I have a lot of stuff that is unique and strange that has managed to fall into my hands in the course of this 15-year odyssey of mine.
Excellent. So this brings me to the next point. So, and this is going to be my own question plus one from the community. So Rod Winchester asks, how did wargaming turn from a simulation used by the military to a hobby played by civilians? And I think that gets at the meat of what we're talking about here, which is essentially how did wargaming evolve from Kriegspiel? So like we said, that's what you cover in your book, Playing at the World. But could you give us a quick kind of connect the dots from Kriegspiel to maybe the present, if that's even
Sure.
doable?
I think so. So, I mean, as I said, there were a lot of Prussian soldiers who played Reisbit style Kriegspiel who definitely took it up as a hobby. And they had their own kind of wargaming clubs that existed around Berlin and around the places where some of the major military bases were. And so it was only really a matter of time once Kriegspiel was popularized, once people started to see, and due to the spectacular Prussian military victories of the 1860s and 1870s, people really took notice of every aspect of Prussian military technique. And when they discovered that Kriegspiel was a big part of how they trained their officers, everybody suddenly wanted to do Kriegspiel. And so there were these English translations of what was, the contemporary Kriegspiel authors like Shishwitz, people like that. The Aldershot translation that they produced for British soldiers was one that was widely available in England in the 1870s. And as a consequence of that, people started taking it up like as a hobby. There was an Oxford University Kriegspiel club that just played it for its entertainment value. And once things got to that level where people could exercise the tool that way, that's when folks like Robert Louis Stevenson started to get involved. And famously, in the early 1880s, Stevenson had health problems throughout his life. He was holed up in a chalet in Davos in Switzerland, and he turned the entire attic of the chalet into this wargaming space where he played with his stepson, this guy Lloyd Osborne. Around 1898, Osborne wrote a series of articles that were very widely read in the UK that were called Stevenson at Play, that described his game. Now, Stevenson never published his rules, but from it you get a sense of how he used toy soldiers, how he used randomness, and he was studying kind of British manuals of military science, like the Hamley, things like that, right? That informed him roughly what the probability should be and how things should move. And he had really turned this into something that seemed like a much simpler hobby game. And that ultimately inspired another very famous author, a guy by the name of H.G. Wells, to put out this book called Little Wars that he first serialized at the end of 1912, and there was a book edition of it in 1913. And this was the start of really the wargaming hobby, where you could go buy a book, and it was a widely available book that just had a set of wargaming rules. It said, okay, here's your toy soldiers, here's how you set up this side and this side, here's how you build wargaming terrain. And that miniature wargaming, although it was a bit constrained by the world wars, honestly. Like, think about it. Little Wars came out in like 1913. The next year, suddenly there was like a lot of problems in Europe. And as a result of that, it didn't really catch on like immediately. But definitely after the World Wars is when kind of the lessons of Wells's book, Little Wars, reached major hobby communities in the United States, where this guy, Jack Scrooby, who was a miniature figure caster, started a magazine called the War Game Digest, which was kind of the first fanzine for gaming that was dedicated to, okay, like what system should we use for gaming? What are you doing with your games here? And okay, I'm going to take that idea from that and apply it this way. And how we do this with medieval games instead of just with these ordinary Napoleonic era games, which are kind of the focus of Little Wars. And yeah, from there everything just took off. And that's the world that Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson grew up in, and the world that like Hallowell, the people who did Reaper Fantasy, which became Warhammer, grew up in, right? So I mean, this was a very vital, was a small but extremely dedicated, enthusiastic hobby in the 50s and 60s.
Great, thanks for that overview. And again, anyone looking to get the whole fleshed out version, turn to Playing at the World. So now there's a lot of awesome modern stuff. I don't know how you could ever cover this in a book. There's so much going on. But one of the ones that is kind of near and dear to my heart is the Total War series, which does pride itself on its kind of war simulator aspect. So to that end, there is a community question from Douglas Lynch here who says, do you think war simulators, such as Total War, give people a real perspective of being a general from the past?
Um, I mean, so I of the Total War series games I played, like Total War Medieval, say,
Oh,
like in medieval times, you wouldn't have that strategy tactical perspective where you really understand, and this is to your point, Julian, about the map, right, and how they really waged war. But that I think these games very faithfully reproduce what wargamers would call a strategy tactical game, where you have a strategic campaign map that you kind of maneuver armies around, right? And when opposing armies meet at a particular point on the strategy map, you then play out this tactical map, which is on a much more detailed resolution of scale. Obviously, they didn't play them out in real time. They weren't in the war games that people played. They didn't have the simultaneous move aspect, is what they would have called it, until pretty late. There were simultaneous move tactical games. Jack Scrooby did some of those even as early as like 1960 or 61. But I mean, in the 19th century, people just weren't thinking about things in these kinds of terms. So I think maybe TW is like more faithful to the innovations you would have seen in the first few years of the full-fledged wargame hobby in America, perhaps, than they were to like the 19th century version.
Right, yeah, and it seems like the main thing that these games, they're now trapped in being a game and being playable, and you can't really go the simulation route because it just loses its fun. So the main thing for me is command and control of the troops is something that you instantly can control every unit and tell them where to go,
Yeah.
exactly start, stop, hold fire. That's the biggest thing that just breaks that simulation down.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
in Rice Bits, right, you have to kind of rely on the fact you wrote good orders and that the umpire is like well disposed to you and is going to execute have his simulation of your troops execute those orders in a way that vaguely resembles what it is that you requested.
To that end, there was an interesting series that BBC hosted called Time Commanders. Did you ever watch that?
I don't think I did.
Ah, so this will interest you. So, and probably viewers. So, Time Commanders was a show where they used a modified version of Rome Total War, and they had. Oh, this will be perfect for you. Okay, so they basically simulated the delegation of commands. So they would have the generals up at a table that was a top-down view, almost Kriegspiel-like, looking at a table, moving, and the commanders would sit there and they'd place their blocks of infantry on this table, and they'd say, "Okay, I want to move this block of cavalry here." They would delegate that to their officers, and then the officers would then turn and talk to the techs who are on the computers,
Got
and
it.
then they would interpret it and move it on the computer, and then there would be a big screen that would show kind of the battle going on. So the commanders delegating this whole battle from the top down did have to go this circuitous route to get
Right.
their commands on the field. So that is actually a cool, huh? I had never put the pieces of that together, but that's an awesome way to turn Total War into this kind of the original way it was done.
No, that's very true. And I mean, I could even imagine actually doing that as a, multiplayer online game, like a team game, where you could imagine, literally just having that board view from one player, and then there are other players who are on your team who are supposed to execute those things according to your instructions, and they have to apply their own judgment and initiative and how to do so.
Yeah, maybe that's an evolution we'll be seeing as people get interested in kind of this crucial part, which is the delegation of the roles, and maybe the dungeon master and the umpire. Maybe people will start taking these games and kind of make an ad hoc version of it, where like yeah, you create a system like we just described, where you introduce an umpire and you split it up, where the video game itself just becomes a part of a greater machine.
Yeah.
That would be cool. That would be cool to see.
Yeah, I think we need to copyright that idea immediately to the patent office.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, yeah, that was a lot of the questions people were asking about Total War. That's one of my early communities that I was a part of. But yeah,
Great
that's a
game.
great one. Yeah, and definitely check out the Time Commanders. Like I said,
Yeah.
they've since tried to revive it, but I don't think it's hit mainstream just yet. Let's see a couple other community questions before we start to wrap things up. So let's see. Jacob d'Autriche here asks, "Is there a game that simulates today's modern warfare?" As in, I probably assume some war simulator game like a Kriegspiel type, not necessarily PC game.
Yeah, I mean, so thinking about that, I mean, the first name that comes to mind, as it should, is Volker Ruhnke, is this great designer who a lot of his games are published by like GMT, who focuses on trying to simulate what contemporary warfare is like. A famous game of his would be like Labyrinth, The War on Terror, which and these are complex, almost more political games that have to deal with the realities of hugely asymmetrical warfare and kind of what events arise in them. And yeah, Runeca's like involved with like the CIA. I think he's an analyst there, and he designs games for them. He's another one of his games would be A Distant Plane. And you can read about this online. I think there was a good WAPO article about A Distant Plane and about its evolution, which is looking at Afghanistan and kind of what the circumstances are that are required to model and simulate warfare under the conditions that we fight in today, which are just so radically different from what these things were like in the 19th century, let alone the early 20th century. And, I mean, I guess I'd add to that as well. Wargaming really took a bit of a hit in the 1940s when Hiroshima and Nagasaki happened. And when we developed ICBMs and we developed long-range strategic bombing, the sorts of things that military scientists at think tanks like RAND then focused on kind of changed from the sort of strategy and tactics that had dominated thinking about wargaming since the 1780s into a very different sort of game. And they tend to have this more overtly political and diplomatic aspect to them. And in fact, in the 1960s, the Joint Chiefs of Staff ran a series of these political exercises that were one of the first places you'll see people use the explicit term role-playing game to describe them, to describe, kind of how you need to have the chiefs of state, the people that are responsible for, the kind of the Secretary of State sort of position, as well as the military people involved in what a conflict resolution looks like in a world where there are nuclear, ICBMs. And so, yeah, I mean, a lot changed about modeling contemporary war with that. And when you look at a lot of the war games that were popular in the 1960s, one thing they have in common is they kind of peter out around then. Like you'll find a lot of war games about Africa Corps, you'll find a lot of war games about Midway, but not a lot of people saw the tactical challenge, I guess, of having a head-to-head competition in an era of nuclear proliferation.
I see. And that dovetails nicely with fantasy.
It
Get
does,
all
yeah.
the world wars you want in a fantasy land.
Yeah, I mean, and Vietnam, I think, had a tremendous impact on the rise of fantasy and wargaming. I think when, Vietnam is really the first war that came home to us every day on the TV set, where we would see, Walter Cronkite or whoever showing us footage from My Lai or, take your pick. And for a lot of people, then to play a fun hobby game, you wanted to have some distance from what contemporary warfare was like. And there's no doubt in my mind that had a certain amount to do with the popularity of Tolkien overall, right?
Hmm.
And the advent of fantasy wargaming that led to chainmail and D&D and Warhammer and all of that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let's see a couple other community questions here. So this will fit nicely. So Akusti Likanen here asks, what about wargaming in modern times? How extensively is it used? So I assume maybe in military war colleges, are you aware that they're still doing these kind of large scale exercises, or maybe even just intro to warfare, and they'll run something like this in a classroom? You know if that's done?
I mean, I talk to people sometimes. People write to me who are teaching classes like this, and talk about it. I mean, I think people do that more in a historical context now than in a military one. I mean, I shouldn't separate those things so severely. I think people still study the history of warfare in order to learn how to be good soldiers. But obviously, a lot of these simulations today rely heavily on computers and things like that. There's a certain amount of this. This isn't my particular bailiwick. I'm sure you could, if you asked, Boko Runke or Peter Perla, people like that, they could speak much better than I could to what the practices are in the military today.
Okay. Yeah, and that's something that I was starting to put feelers out, trying to reach out to various war colleges in the U.S. and naval colleges to see kind of how do they simulate warfare today, and especially teach it in the classroom. So hopefully we can look forward to something about that in the future. Another question here from David Thorpe about kind of contemporary wargaming. He says, in the case of contemporary wargaming, do governments ever bring in civilians to act as rebel or unconventional fighting forces in simulations, or do they strictly rely on their officers to play those roles?
I mean, I'm sure, civilians have long been involved in the way that the military conducts their simulations. And you hear about people like James Dunnigan, would be a great example. He's one of the principals at SPI. Dunnigan, was brought in to help design and oversee simulations that the military ran in the 1970s into the 1980s. I think even during the Gulf War, he was a bit of a talking head that you might see on whatever CNN discussing how people kind of game and simulate these situations through. I don't know to what degree, they really actively try to recruit civilians, or why civilians would be better for that kind of unconventional sort of role than any other. But again, you could find people better than me to answer that.
Yeah, it seems like an interesting question. I think what they're getting at is like, did people ever experiment with throwing a wrench into things just by bringing someone who has no idea what's going on and might have a novel train of thought?
Well, in the history of D&D, famously there were these Brownstein games. These were played in Dave Arneson's circles in the Twin Cities that were kind of staged as these Prussian Napoleonic era war games where it's France versus Germany. But like Dave Wesley, who ran these games, he would assign roles, civilian roles as well. for this town of Brownstein. And so there would be the mayor of the town, the chancellor of the university, people would play university students, and they would do very much that. They would throw monkey wrenches in everything that was going on in the Prussian defense. And this is one of the many catalysts that had led to role-playing games, was having that notion that there were kind of non-combatant actors who would be an influence on the situation of these games. And the next thing you know, things have drifted very far from a conflict simulation and towards something much stranger.
Excellent. Yes, and all this hinting at the modern stuff has me itching to do videos on this. Very, very interesting stuff. So yeah, with that, I think we'll start to wrap up the video. So again, I did want to plug John Peterson's book here, Playing at the World. It's an excellent read, even though I just got the early chapters. That in and of itself would make it worth it, but you have a whole breadth of other topics in there. So definitely check it out. And if you could use the affiliate link in the description below. John, is there anything else you wanted to plug here at the end?
I mean, again, this Art and Arcana book, if you happen to be interested in the history of Dungeons and Dragons, it's really pretty. It's got lots of pictures. We went and found all the original art and things like that. And yeah, I have like a million projects that are coming out, but like I'll plug those when they're actually out. So
Sounds good. And people can follow you for up-to-date news on what's the best way?
probably Twitter. I'm at Docetist on Twitter, Docetist.
Excellent. All right, we'll link that as well. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you all the viewers who made it this far in the video. And like we said, we've seeded, I think, a lot of cool ideas that we can hopefully follow up on in the future. So definitely also post comments below if you have any specific topics you want answers to, and we can take that into consideration. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, and thanks for having me, Julie. And again, I love seeing people take an interest in this crucial turn in intellectual history that I think has not received nearly as much attention as it should have.
Yes. Well, as the community grows, you're going to start to get the people who are like, hey, it's time to start jotting down the history of this growing community, and we'll get all these ancillary services that come into it. So it's cool. Cool to see. It's good for the hobby. All right. Well, take care, everyone. Bye-bye.